So this mound of rock, which might be ignored by a lot of people, this was a big find for you archaeologists, is that right?
Yeah, so about 10 years, well, 12 years ago now, they were putting in the new Route 1 Gateway project, and professional archaeologists came up here, and at the time it was all bare ground, and they actually found a few artifacts that were sitting around, and when they brought them in, we had a discussion, and it was recognized that they could potentially be quite early. And so we had other folks come out, look at it, and they actually found some artifacts that are quite diagnostic of kind of the earliest currently recognized inhabitants of the region. So initially we were thinking this site was 12,500 to about 13,000 years ago. And so our staff came in 2011, and we actually did about a 19-week excavation of a site that was, so we did about 3 weeks on this site. There's another site that's just off to another site of the same age that's just about 200 meters just to the east. And then we immediately started a discussion around this site is so early, so significant that we need to move the highway. And so the Department of Transportation undertook about a $2 million project to actually move the highway and to preserve this site. But in the process of doing it, they found another site that's probably about another 200 meters to the west, and that site dates to around 4,400 years ago to about 3,200 years ago, maybe even a little bit later or more recent than that. And that site it was agreed that site would be excavated in order to make way for the highway, in order to preserve these older sites. And so we did about 19 weeks total here, and what we found was this site is actually likely to be a little bit older than what we had initially thought. In the years since, because of where this site is located, it's actually up on a bedrock knoll that, when we were doing coring around it, and the Department of Transportation were doing coring around it, they actually found quite a number of shells. And the shells dated to around 13,100 years ago, which calibrates to around 14,000 calendar years ago. And so we know that there was sea up against these areas around 14,000 years ago. Now we think people were living here around 13,000 years ago, just based on comparative analysis with other artifacts. But what we think is that the sea had receded, and that these low areas which had formerly been inundated were all wetlands, and these were the high promontories and relatively well-drained soils adjacent to these wetland areas, which would have been resource areas. And so what we ended up finding here was a type of site we had never found in New Brunswick, and we built models based on that, and we've extrapolated that out to the rest of the province. And since this site was found, there's been another 10 sites found like it, and they're completely attributable to the modeling that was done based on these sites.
Right, definition of terms, artifacts, what did you find?
So artifacts here were primarily, debitage, which would be the material that comes, the cast-offs, the pieces that come from making stone tools, the reduction of a lithic reduction sequence. Formal tools, we had large scrapers, unifaces that were probably used for scraping hides or woodworking. We had very, very large spear points. So these would be of a diagnostic type, a fluted base to them, and what's referred to by archaeologists as a King's Road or a Whipple type, which are the kind of earliest recognized type that we have in northeastern North America. Now, the reason we think this site is actually quite a bit older now is some of the sites that we have found as a result of the modeling of this are themselves 12,600 to 12,700 years. We have the radiocarbon dates to confirm that. And what we've found is that there's quite a bit of difference, and there's a huge amount of technological change between this site and that site. Enough that we're pretty sure that we have a site here that's more like 13,000 to 13,500 years ago, which, if you imagine what's happening based on our climatological reconstructions, 14,100 is about the same time you've got sea level coming in. It's about the same time you've got this part of the province deglaciated. So within 500 years or so of this part of the province being deglaciated, you have people moving in, which is probably, if you think about how long it would actually take for some of these colonizing species that people would subsist upon, people are into the province almost, or what's now New Brunswick, almost as early as they can. So
now you speak of technology, and of course a stone that fits the hand nicely can be a piece of technology. Marshall McLuhan said a stirrup was technology. What is the technology you found here?
So the technology here is and now it's hard because what we find preserved on sites like this are probably represent maybe an estimated 5% of what people were using. This is the difference between these type of sites, these interior sites, and the shell middens. And so the interpretation has been that these large spear points are part of a technology where they're on a foreshaft. So you'd have a spear which has an end on it that basically when you thrust it into an animal or you throw it, more likely thrust, you can pull it out and you would have a number of these that you could set on and thrust in. And now that's a technology that, you know, that has a long history. Basically, it goes quite far back in history, but it persists here until about 11,600 years ago, and then it looks like about that time people are, based on the style of the points, that they're transferring over into using spear throwers and atlatls. So these folks don't appear to have had that. They appear to have been the progenitors of the folks that developed the atlatl technology in northeastern North America. The other thing we have is one of the site that's about 200 meters off to our east is actually a specialized processing area. There's about 100 unifaces that are found on that site, and almost none of the bifaces or the spear points. And so that seems to be an area where people are actually processing things. Now, in terms of what they're processing, we actually have a protein. So all the artifacts that we find now, we excavate with gloves. There's a chain of custody. We kind of use a forensic approach to dealing with these to try to not introduce modern contaminants in. And the reason we do that is to try to get residue analysis off these tools. And what we found on the site, that specialized processing site, is a protein residue from a bear, and it wasn't. It's not likely a black bear. We don't know what it is. We don't even know what bears were around at that time that early. But it didn't have a strong reaction with black bear antisera. It was much more closer to, say, a brown bear or a polar bear, that kind of thing. And so you can imagine that whatever they're doing here, I mean, they're processing apex predators. So whether they're actually going and hunting or they're trapping, I mean, you know, with large deadfall traps or whatever, they are actually on the landscape, but they're interacting and obviously taking some of the apex predators around. So you get a real connection with the landscape.
How do you know the heads you've found aren't just missing their shafts? How do you know that they were replacement heads for a reusable shaft?
Well, I guess that's the thing. That's the interpretation, right? And that's why it's so important to have not just archaeologists synthesizing as much data as possible, but also having, you know, oral traditions and elders and folks and looking at analogs elsewhere. And so, you know, this foreshaft technology was used in the Paleolithic in Europe as well. And so there are a lot of other, you know, they may not be related, but these kind of things seem to have been invented as a hunting strategy independently around the world. And so really, we don't know. These are just our best interpretations. So
now you say the modeling you did. Do you happen to mean making an actual model, or what does modeling?
So this would be a GIS. So this would be a computer model, which basically, so it looks to. So the entire landscape of what's now New Brunswick at a 1 meter basically interval, we have modeled the slope, we've modeled the drainage, the forest cover, we've modeled proximity to watercourses, what direction it is sheltered from, all of these things. And what we try to do with a site like this is we actually, and also elevation, very importantly elevation and slope, Because on a site like this, what we would have done is, or what we did do, is we measured exactly where the shell was found. And at that elevation, we inferred that that was the high level stand, which in here is about 38 meters. And what we did was we projected 38 to 42 meters, because that's where we had found the actual archaeological finds on this site and also on the site over there. We found nothing below it, and we didn't find anything above it here, but that's because that's the maximum elevation we have. When we then projected that over the entire, first over the entire province, what we found was some other known sites that we had, that we had individual artifacts from around that had been found over the last 150 years fit directly on this shoreline. And then what we found is it didn't fit in some other areas, because what you could do is you could actually look, and a lot of aggregate pits were right below that, because what the aggregate pits are looking at is where you get the washed gravels and sands and stuff. And what that was actually predicting was where was that shoreline and where was the area in front of that shoreline. And so we could kind of use that to fine tune our model. And then we chose 21 locations where a road went across the shoreline, and then we went and actually tested those and found that you could see these wave-cut benches on the and these visible shoreline features. And then we've since confirmed that with testing, subsurface testing, where you can see the sediments. Now, it turned out that it doesn't work over the entire part of the province, because what that represents, and the reason that sea level was higher at the time, is because you had basically the pushing down of the Earth's crust by the weight of all the ice that had been over it. When the ice melted, the Earth stayed a bit depressed, and so it slowly came up, and that's why you get relative sea level rise. And what we get is, as that's rising, we get periods in which it was fairly stable, and it would actually kind of enshrine a wave-cut bench along that receding sea level curve. And so we've counted now 19 of those that are in southwestern New Brunswick. If you go on Minister's Island, you can see all 19 of them there. And what that reflects is that's the sea level. People were occupying those landscapes, sometimes contemporary with when the sea was there, but on sites like this, they were occupying them because they were well-drained soil that was adjacent to these wetland areas that had been created. And so what that has done is it has allowed us to extrapolate that to the rest of the province. And now what we're trying to do is to date those individual, we know how old this one is, we're trying to date all the other ones so that we can actually, when we find sites on those, we can actually infer what age they might have been before we get into actually interpreting the archaeological resources themselves.
Now, if I were writing, say, an undergraduate paper for you in archaeology, and I said they sort of have a topographical map that shows topography over time,
yep.
And when something is discovered at a particular elevation or near sea or away from the sea, they can determine lifestyle, sources of food, etc., and then they can extrapolate that to another topographical area in another part of the province with some certainty. That's
right. Well, the certainty there is, so that comes to the other side of what we've built into this. So, that model was self-fulfilling, because we were only looking at the areas where we anticipated there were going to be sites. So about 10 years ago, the other thing we changed with the way we do archaeology in New Brunswick was we basically started to do a probabilistic testing model, which involved us testing 1% of the landform. And the reason we were trying to do that is we were trying to get a high statistical confidence in what we were finding, that what we were finding in our test pits was reflective of what was on the ground. And so that's where the modeling really, really came into its own, when we started incorporating that kind of data. Because what we found was, and we also started developing with private industry new approaches and new ways of testing. Like we started looking at mechanized means of actually testing deep sediments and things that we hadn't previously ever looked at, because we didn't think there were high potential for sites. And so we have a model that until 2016 was finding 97% of the known sites. And then we used this probabilistic model, and we tested an area in northern New Brunswick. It was a 19-kilometer transect. We brought in our technology that allowed us to test quite a bit. and we did about 20,000 test pits. And what we found was only 2% of the sites that were actually there were captured by the model. And that the sites that were actually, so about 300% increase in the number of sites over what we anticipated finding. And they were all in areas that would previously everybody would have assumed were just low potential.
And doesn't mining work in this way, that this type of rock and this type of soil and this kind of elevation leads one to believe that a certain ore might be there?
Exactly. Now, I mean, there's some agency in there with people because, I mean, you know, you have to infer certain types of resources that may not be there anymore. For instance, the site that's 200 meters to our, or 140 meters to our west, that was excavated, we couldn't figure out why that site was actually there because it's there 4,000 years ago. It has a small stream around it, and on the site what we were finding was a lot of occupational debris, some processing areas with all these large stones which are used for grinding, but we couldn't figure out what they were actually doing with it. And so what we did is we cored in the marshy areas, and we found repeated burn layers, very regular, and we dated those, and they dated to roughly contemporary with when the site, we knew the site, or we were interpreting that the site was occupied. So we knew there was a relationship there. And then when we we found a bunch of groundstone axes, sent them away assuming that, and different styles of groundstone axe, and we sent them away assuming that they might be from different time periods, and but they're all probably doing the same thing. And what we found was there was a whole class of groundstone axe, what we would think of as an axe, which was actually not used as an axe. It was used this way because you could see the phytoliths of it had actually created stria from when they were being scraped through some kind of woody plants. And then we actually found some of the phytoliths themselves that had been cut by this tool. And what we found out is that there was actually this seed grass called mountain rice, or Oxyrhynchus, which was actually through the entire site. We even found huge concentrations of it. And so it's clear that people were actually processing, and it also looks like they might have been undertaking a bit of horticulture on these sites, because these are colonizing plants, and so it looks like people were actually keeping burning the wetland area so that these plants would keep coming. Now, Oxyrhynchus is now, or the mountain rice is actually now extirpated from this area, and it's actually up on the Gas Bay. You have to go to find it. And so, you know, one of the reasons that site might have been abandoned is with climate change and things, the favorable growth area for this moved further north. And so
if we're writing a headline in a newspaper 12,000 or so years ago, you might say there's not only hunting, there's not only gathering, but there is also proto-farming.
Well, that would be about 4,000 years ago. That's a different age site. But on this site here, we did actually find one large grinding stone, and so there was some kind of processing. Now, whether that's any kind of whether they're actually, it's just harvesting something and your typical foraging. But on the 4,000 year site, absolutely, and you know, that's very significant. That's some of the earliest evidence of that you'll find in North America, or at least Eastern North America. And in with it, there were some really interesting features that we found. One of them was a cleaned off living floor that had been curated for quite a while. And on this living floor, there was about 3,000 artifacts that were thrown off the side of it. And it was clear that over time, people continued, it was a raised kind of platform, that artifacts were continually, over the course of a couple hundred years, thrown into a midden. And now again, this is a not like the shell midden. This is a midden that likely would have had food remains and everything else in it, but only the stone was preserved. And there was about 3,000 artifacts in that. And then there was some large post molds, and so we can infer that these are some semi-permanent structures that are down on this. Now, again, 13,000 years ago here, by 4,000 years ago, we get a lot of that kind of activity. So,
now, what sort of artifacts were in the couple of 100-year midden that you're talking about?
So, these unique forms of axes that turn out to be knives were in it. We had quite a number of bifaces, which are probably some of them could have been knives, some of them could have been spears. Other ones look like they were actually used for there were spoke shaves and things. Like there was, you really get the picture of people are doing all the activities you would expect from a dynamic kind of long-term village site where people are going off into the woods, they're hunting, they're fishing, they're doing all those kind of things, and then bringing everything back. And what ties people to this site, one of the things that ties people to the site, is the fact that there is a regular cereal that is here. And what we kind of have interpreted, and we're still working on this, is that that raised platform is the kind of thing you get when people are actually, so we found some pieces of cut birch bark. And what we've inferred is that we know that people were using bark barrels back to 3,000 and 4,000 years, and that's likely what we have here, is that people are actually preparing this gruel that you get from this kind of activity, drying it out, and then potentially storing it in some of these bins, and then having it as a raised area so you don't get water and stuff coming in and spoiling these things.
Now, did you see clear evidence as to why those stone objects and objects that were preserved for so many thousands of years, why were they discarded? Or was it kind of a repository where people would say, well, I'll store this here and use it later? Or what do you infer?
Yeah, almost all of them. Well, there's a few that were not broken, and you question why they were just... So there were little activity areas. For instance, there was an area with a large anvil where we had pieces of these big boulders of Kineo Traveler Mountain porphyry, which are a very high-grade material from central Maine. And you could tell that people had just literally... They were processing things, and they had other ones to process, and they had just left them there. And so we collected every single rock from the top of that mound so that we could reconstruct that over time if we were ever to, if there were ever to be an interpretive center here. Because there's a lot of the activity, I don't think that we 3D scanned the entire site. But it was obvious that was the way that people had left the site. Now, some of them were broken. Had the bits broken off them. Some of them were broken and left exactly where they had broke, because you could see the 2 or 3 pieces slightly disarticulated, but still within in a short distance. And then other ones were retouched and retouched and retouched to the point where there was nothing left on them, and then they were discarded. So
now, isn't the news here, to me anyway, that people inhabited this spot for a lot longer than our history books, if they even mention indigenous people, that a lot longer than we thought, 14,000
Absolutely, years. Over 600 generations. If you think about, the 14 or so generations that Europeans have since the Mayflower, I mean, this is over 600 generations, and, that is that time immemorial. And so when you're looking at, massive climate change has occurred since then. The entire outlook and shape of the province has changed completely in that amount of time. And so I think the other message that's here is that, this is, these ancestral Wabanaki folks that were on these sites. There is a continuity in terms of how how people adapted to those things over time. And this site and that site, what's really interesting is a lot of times, we didn't find it on this site, but there's a lot of times, particularly on the St. John River, where you will find artifacts that are found 2,000 years after they were produced, or 3,000 years, and people are actually, and you think about the ultimate rock hounds are people who are actually looking for high quality stone tools to make stone tools out of. And we have multiple instances where people were finding these artifacts many thousands of years after they were made, recognizing that they were human made, and then altering them so they could use them again. And so, people were aware that there was a long history to the occupation. It's just now what we're starting to understand is, with sites like this, we don't know what happened before the last glaciation, but we infer that ever since the Wisconsin glaciation, as soon as deglaciation started, almost within 500 years, people are occupying this, and so as long as it's been possible to occupy this, the land, people have been occupying it. So,
Was there occupation in the Ice Age, during, before? Do we have any idea?
so there's nobody has really any idea. The current thinking is no, but also keep in mind that there's 4 kilometers of ice that goes over the area, and it's grinding down mountains and everything else, and so, you know, all the evidence suggests that, you know, earliest occupations are sometime between 15 and 20,000 years ago. But again, that's subject to, if there was any evidence here, it's all going to be ground up, and you would find things in glacial till. And now there's been suggestions that things have been found before in glacial till, but till by its very nature, you know, it isn't stratified. It's often not stratified, and so, you know, trying to determine how old those things are, or even if they've been found in till, because if you can imagine a site like this, if there was a scree slope and an artifact fell out of the top into the till, over time you'd be impossible to determine, was it in the till originally, or was it actually in some of the overbearing sediments. And so, yeah.
The other mystery, if people came here soon in geological times after the Ice Age, where'd they come from?
That's the question. So one of the reasons it's so interesting that you have a site that's this early is this is actually almost earlier than some of the sites in adjacent Maine. This is contemporary with some of the early sites you get in Massachusetts, and what it suggests is people are, if there are a colonizing population in terms of, you know, probably not the best terminology, but the fact is that people are actually, as soon as they can move into this new landscape, if it is in fact a new landscape they're moving into, they're doing it very rapidly. That's what sites like this indicate. Now, are they reoccupying a landscape that they had occupied before? I mean, there is no real evidence of that right now, but like I said, I mean, you know, no one can definitively say one way or the other. Where they're coming from, the current thinking is that there's multiple influxes of people. So you may have some that date back to the 20,000 years, but you can clearly see around 10,000 years ago, maybe 10 to 11,000 years ago, you get in western Alaska, you do see people coming in that are using different types of tools. Now, they may be related, they may be the same group, or they may be just introducing new technologies. But we can't infer the people. We can infer the people, but we can really only interpret the tools. There's new technological traditions that are coming in. Same thing happens around 3,000 years ago with the Arctic small tool tradition, where all across the Arctic you have the introduction of new tools. And so, again, that could just be a great new idea that's spreading, or it could be new migrants coming in. And certainly for the northern populations, there's always been that suggestion that they are closely related to some of the folks in Siberia and stuff. And so it's not a simple, it's as opposed to, oh, they just came from Siberia or they just came from Europe. They may have also had some folks that had come over during previous glaciations. I mean, nobody knows, but it is multiple influxes of different technological influences, and whether that denotes people, that's, nobody can say for sure. So,
well, then there's the why question. Why did they come? One assumes reasonably happy living wherever they are, northeast, southwest of here.
Yep.
And the deglaciation happens very slowly at a glacial pace, if I may say. And why'd they come?
Well, I think the thing is, I mean, if you think about any land that's been new land that's found, you have pioneering populations that want to go out there and discover and find, and there's new resources. And I mean, if you have a certain group of the population that is adapted specifically to hunting on tundra-like environments, and that tundra-like environment keeps moving because of climate change in response to deglaciation, then you can see how that would motivate it. But at the same time, you have to, if people came in around between 15 and 20,000 years ago, then within 5,000 years ago, they had occupied everywhere from Alaska to South America. that if you do the math on that, that suggests that people are constantly moving. That some element of every of these societies is constantly moving, and so the model for these types of sites have always been you have a main site and then satellite sites, and the way that people would move over the landscape is you have a large aggregation site, perhaps like this, and then you have your little satellite sites, and that people, wherever there is a satellite site that can support the population, people gradually move in that direction. And so if that model works for, a pioneering population like this that's coming in, then maybe that is the same model that people are using, throughout North and South, Central and South America. So.
Well, how about the speculation that it is either a physical reason or a sociological reason to move? That there are these tantalizing stories from archaeology of finding seeds in South America that are indigenous to Egypt, and thus the Egyptians must have had trade with South America 7,000 years ago. I mean, wildly speculative, but very, very interesting. So if you found certain seeds that or other artifacts that showed people were trading or moving or what have you to this site because of a need for food, more rich land, or the bounty of the sea, that would be the physical need. If that isn't the case with a sparse population, then there's a psychological need. They just like traveling.
Well, I think that's the thing is, without this, you get into a couple things there. One of them is, we hear wild stories about things that have been found on archaeological sites, but it's only been recently that you have those forensic approach to, not introducing modern contaminants in. And so I think all of those kind of finds have to be really looked at to make sure that they're, they meet the same standard that all of us would like to base these kind of really consequential interpretations of. But there certainly are some interesting, there's a Norse coin that was found in a shell midden on the Goddard site on coastal Maine. What's interesting there is it's not necessarily indicative of that the Norse were there, but it's indicative that somebody had some interaction with the Norse or a Norse site. And what it shows is we do have, it fits in very well with a lot of material that we know is from northern Labrador that's being traded about that time. We find it all throughout North America, or all throughout, New Brunswick. There's some of it in Nova Scotia, some in PEI. And so, these internal trade networks are extremely sophisticated and really long-standing.
Do I take it from what you're saying that that there were not only nomadic people or migrating people by season, but also people who lived permanently in many of these locations, all three at the same time?
Yeah, and keep in mind, it's over 600 generations. A lot of the archaeology kind of gets squashed together. We just don't have the resolution right now to figure out, are there people that are more mobile during certain times, or is it that in a society is as diverse, just like nowadays, where you have truck drivers which are nomadic and you have other people who are more sedentary, and that what we're picking up there is not different people or different populations, but in the individual agency. And so that's a long discussion and a long debate in archaeology, long-standing debate. But the issue is there's just not enough data at this point. If you think about sites like this, 10 years ago, we didn't know that we were thinking the oldest sites we'd ever find in New Brunswick were around 11,600. Now we're back to beyond 13,000 years ago. And so, it's a little hard to interpret the totality of a society, an ancient society, and that's why archaeologists really should be cautious about this, because it's only as accurate as the next find. And also, it needs to include the interpretation from, the descendants, because they have their own traditions that are also very important to include into these interpretations. So.
If we were writing an episode of Star Trek and thinking of 10,000 years from now, looking back on our time and trying to explain it, how could we possibly come up with an explanation why someone would become a long-distance trucker,
Yes.
or have a huge collection of chalk,
Yep.
or maybe a bunch of tools?
Yep.
And sometimes it just defies explanation. They did what they did because that's what they wanted to do.
Well, and I think a trucker's a very good example, because in an archaeological context, we would likely assume that the person that's transporting the stuff is themselves the trader, as opposed to the conduit. And those are the real issues with you can only interpret so far with the archaeology, and I think that's why you've seen all around the world where archaeology's has been fallen on its face a couple times for making those kind of interpretations, and that's where you have to really take into context the cultural context of these, what were common to the descendant cultures, and get input from elders to help with that, because certainly somebody whose grandfather was or 15th great grandfather was a trucker might have some more insight into, no, that's he's being paid to convey that material, as opposed to he is the trader that's actually doing that. And in an archaeological context, you have the exact same thing. You have people who have been interpreted as being part of, they are themselves traders who are moving things around, likely because in the European context, that's what we had, early European context, but they themselves may have been part of a large industry, and they may have had a specialized task in that. And I think this whole recognition of specialization is something that I don't think it's really been fully explored by archaeologists in North America, because everybody's good at certain things, and I think we always assume that somebody living in a small encampment, they can do everything, they have to do everything. But there certainly have been some indications that some people, they have specialized tasks. Well, in order to have that specialized task, there has been some way of recognizing that has value and paying recompense to the people who are doing that. And so, you do have these, that's how I think you get into these discussions of certain raw tool materials, certain artifacts. Like, there are certain artifacts that come from specific sites that are like cookie cutters, and so similar that you could almost argue that there's an industry that makes a certain type of tool. And so I think that's the kind of thing that is really interesting as you start looking at the complexity of these kind of ancient cultures and the people that they represent. Is there's an awful lot of complexity. Just like if someone were to look at our society from 10,000 years ago and took 5% of what we have now, all of the organics would be gone. Most of our plastics would be gone. And then to try to interpret what you or I did on a daily basis, what is the material remains that we leave of the activities that we do? And that's the real confronting thing about archaeology, because you see overreach quite a bit in terms of what you can interpret. And if we're really honest, and we're having those honest discussions with elders and with traditional knowledge holders, then there's only so far you can take the archaeology. No one has all the information. Same with when you're talking about oral traditions. Once you go so far back, you may not have the minutia. Putting those things together is likely results in at least a closer interpretation of what the society likely looked like. So
now, a while back you made reference to maybe there should be an interpretive center here, or maybe there will be one day. Let's say you're the guide in your retirement, the sage. What are the sort of things you'd want people to know that we haven't discussed yet?
Well, I think the big one is the fact that so little work has been done here. All those questions that I just spoke about, and all those cautionary things, that's why we haven't excavated these sites. When this site was no longer under threat, and we knew that we could preserve it, then we haven't rushed back to excavate, because what we really wanted to do was have that conversation with the community about what's the way that we could proceed with this, where we could try to put all the partners in play and the technology in play to to squeeze as much information as we could respectfully out of a site like this. And I think it's the same thing, and we learned that from that site that we excavated, the 4,000-year-old site, because Technically, I think that's probably the most perfect excavation that I've managed to do, because we put much rigor in place that we had checks and balances. And so, before or since, I don't think I've managed a project that had that kind of controls over the data and where I can be that confident in what came from it. But it's been 12 years. And to excavate now, there's a whole different technologies that we would use for this. And we have to acknowledge that that's going to continue to happen. And so if we were to expose some of this site so that people could come and look at it, what are those methodologies we'd put in place to gather more of that information? And the specific questions, there are stone tool types that were found here that we don't know where they come from. So there's sources that we don't know where the stone tool came from. Some more work on trying to figure out where those came from. There are a lot of materials that are from north central Maine. We don't currently have sites that are this age in north central Maine. So we know that there are sites there because we have stone tools made out of that material. And so it's working with our colleagues in Maine to try to really figure out where this material likely was coming from, and do they in fact have anything that's contemporary to this site. And then finally, all the faunal stuff that's missing. If we excavated this a different way and we focused on it, we could likely say, what were people eating when they were on this site? Because it's so old that even when we found hearth features, like a fire pit, almost all the charcoal is gone because of just the percolating of groundwater. So we would just get the reddened soil with just little flecks of charcoal in it. And that'll give you an idea of just how old a site is, because charcoal is almost inorganic when it gets burnt to that degree, and even that is dissolving over time. So